Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited to share that I recently launched 365 Days with Catherine of Aragon. This immersive learning experience is much more than just an online course. Over 12 months in 2026, participants will come together and contribute to a supportive and inspiring online community of individuals who'll share in a unique learning experience, one that will ultimately deepen their understanding of the life and times of Catherine of Aragon. Together, we'll explore many aspects of Catherine's life, from her origins and upbringing in Spain to her legacy and afterlife. I'll guide participants every step of the way, but I'll also be joined by a stellar list of 28 contributors, including the renowned historian and broadcaster, Dr. Elizabeth Norton, who'll deliver the keynote address. Head to my website, onthetudortrail.com, for further details, including a full list of sessions and presenters and testimonials from current participants. I do hope you'll consider joining me on this unique learning experience. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Eleanor Barnett back to the show to talk about her new book, Leftovers, A History of Food Waste and Preservation. Eleanor is a food historian at Cardiff University with a PhD from the University of Cambridge. She writes the monthly historical recipe column for BBC History magazine and, as History Eats on Instagram, posts daily food history content to a large audience. Her new book, Leftovers, A History of Food Waste and Preservation, is out now. From the Tudor kitchen to the present day, Leftovers explores how we became such a throwaway society and how our ancestors sought to prevent food from going to waste through preservation, the thrifty reimagining of leftovers, and the recycling of food scraps. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome back to Talking Tudors, Eleanor. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's so lovely to have you back on the show. It's been a while. So
Yes.
maybe a good place to start is you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a food historian. I'm currently at Cardiff University and I have a PhD from Cambridge University. So I use this tool of food as this amazing way into kind of the daily experiences, values, identities of ordinary people in the past. My major area of expertise is the early modern era, Tudors. So I look at things like how the Reformation, which is what I came on to speak about before, the Reformation, how that interacted with food, colonization, and globalization. So those kind of big themes of the era, how they interacted with food. I've recently published my first book, though, which is called Leftovers, A History of Food Waste and Preservation, which starts in the Tudor kitchen. my comfort zone, but moves right up to the present day and even looks into the future, which we're going to talk about today. And I do a lot of work in the media as well in terms of food history. So I write the monthly food history recipe column for BBC History magazine, which means lots of actual cooking, historical cooking. And I post every day on History Eats on Instagram, something to do with the wonderful world of food history.
Lovely. I love your Instagram account. Highly recommend
Thank you.
check that one out. And we are here to talk about your new book. Congratulations. It's very exciting
Thank
news.
you.
So as you said, Leftovers, a history of food waste and preservation. So what actually inspired you to write this?
So this is a lockdown project. I think like many books of this era are, I think. So for me, I was obviously very aware of food because I'm a food historian. And it seemed shocking to me that you could see all these images of mass food waste. At least here in the UK, there were stories about milk having to be thrown down slurry pits because, they didn't have the lorry drivers anymore to come and pick up the milk. Things that there was the infamous pig cull over here where 100,000 pigs had to just be slaughtered and then meat just burnt, it went to waste because again of this breakdown of the supply chains. And at the same time, I think for the first time, at least in my memory, we couldn't get all of the food that we wanted to at the supermarket, right? So it suddenly made food even more sort of significant, I think, when we couldn't get everything that we wanted as we're used to. And so I started looking into kind of this conflict between this idea of abundance and the fact that food goes to waste, and found these shocking statistics. So a third of the food that we produce globally goes to waste. And, in the UK, we waste 10 million tons of food each year. That made me think as a historian, how did we become such a wasteful society? Can we learn from the past, people in the past, about how to be more sustainable? And it appeared to me to be the right time to write this book because, climate change is a massive contributor to climate change. And there are these huge kind of international targets which are actually coming up. So the United Nations now has really very little time to reach its target to decrease food waste globally by 50% by 2030. And what it kind of ended up being is, I think an important book, an important history of food waste, but also a fun one. And it asks questions about, how did people prevent food from going to waste through preservation? How did they reimagine their leftovers in the kitchen into new dishes? And how did they otherwise kind of recycle or reuse their food scraps? And as I say, through food, it's this amazing way of connecting to ordinary people in the past. And it's fun as well because there's lots of images, lots of disgusting stories about gone off food, and lots of recipes as well and tips from the past, as well as some things that we don't want to be doing anymore.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. And of course, also so important. As you've said, those statistics are shocking, aren't they? They're
Yes.
really eye-opening. But you talked about the fact that your book starts in the Tudor kitchen. Yes, we love that. So what kinds of foods were available in Tudor England for the ordinary sort of person?
Yeah, so of course there's a great variety depending on your social status. Most people, of course, would live in rural environments at the time. So labourers on farms, for example, would have had quite a simple diet of mixed grain breads, so rye, barley, oats, peas, things like that. It was only the wealthy who would have white bread. They'd have things like pottage, which is interesting for me in terms of leftovers because it's just have a kind of cauldron in the farmhouse, which would just be bubbling away like a kind of thick soup filled with, seasonal vegetables and then any leftovers from other meals. So yeah, people would have had things like bread and ale, maybe some fried bacon, eggs, that kind of thing. Cheese if you're working in the field, or there's some other fun things like wig, which is a fermented drink that labourers would have had in the kind of hot summer, made from the leftovers from the cheese making process. I think it's interesting that, I think when people think of Tudor food, they probably think of those amazing banquets and feasts that, Henry VIII would have had. And, I explore some of those in the book as well. There's some fabulous stories of birds jumping out of pies and sugar sculptures. Wolsey had a whole chessboard made out of sugar sculpture commissioned, and it even had movable pieces. So there's all that happening, and they would eat just absolutely everything that was an animal they would eat. But at the other end of the social spectrum, meat was a luxury. You'd have a household pig, perhaps, but then the slaughtering of that pig would have been this ritual event that, everybody would have been involved with, and they would have made use of every little bit of that animal. So blood would be blood pudding, you'd make hams, bacon, then you'd more heavily salt brine something to save for later. You'd fry up innards, you'd make the head meat into brawn, you'd save the bones in a brine to add flavour to sauces, and you'd even save the fat to use for cooking.
It's amazing. When you were talking about the pottage, I was thinking how similar, and really the other aspects as well, how similar to the way our great-grandparents ate, for instance. Like I know my mum always tells me stories of my great-grandmother that spent most of the day at the kitchen kind of just peeling vegetables and putting into a big pot and minding that all day and adding anything that was left over. So it sort of continues, doesn't it, through the centuries?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that maybe we've lost touch with our reliance on, big supermarkets. Everything comes in a bag. But I think that was one of the loveliest things about doing this book, was to kind of rediscover the kind of cyclical nature of cooking and to kind of, get creative with your food choices and see what you do have left over and bung it in a pot, see what you can create.
Yeah, absolutely. And so talk to us a little bit about the role of the Tudor housewife then in relation to providing food and drink for her family.
Yeah, so it's certainly, I think, as it still is today, right? It's still a kind of gendered practice. So if you were a labourer, again, the housewife was supposed to do the cooking, also the medicine, which in the Tudor world is actually very kind of almost the same thing as cookery, using the same ingredients. So they'd have kind of a role in physic, as they would say, in healing people in that household and the wider community. It would have been the women who would milk the cows and things like that. Meanwhile, the husband would be off doing the husbandry, which meant things like tolling the field, hunting or hawking, things like that. There's, again, of course, a difference between people of different social economic classes. And one thing that's interesting for the history of preservation is the practice of making jams and marmalades, things like that, fruit preserves, which were almost exclusively the domain of wealthy elite women. So while they might have employed, or they did employ, lower down women to run aspects of their household and cookery, they kind of exclusively took on the making of these really exotic, in their minds, fruit preserves and marmalades. And there's lots of recipe books that are published from the era that celebrate those types of sugary treats, because of course that was the most expensive and luxurious way of preserving your food.
And you talked earlier about the fact that a lot of people, of course, lived down in the country, so they had a little bit of space to grow things. So what are the things that people are growing at this time at home?
So all sorts of things, what you can imagine, vegetables. Of course, this is before, the discovery of the Americas and the New World food comes over. So things like tomatoes we don't have. But lots of native vegetables they would have been growing. They also would have just foraged for fruits. So whereas the wealthy are growing imported fruits like oranges are at the time mainly the bitter kind of Seville kind in the Elizabethan era. But the sweeter version, which is the Asian orange, only comes in I think it's 1529. And then it takes a long time to be more widely seen. It's seen as a really highly prized fruit, and the wealthy are growing them in special orangeries. So again, that's of course a very different experience of fruit from, the labourer in the rural countryside who would, maybe pick some apples or whatever they could kind of find. Even in urban environments, so I'd say the pig is such an important animal because you could feed your pig on the scraps of your own diet, and chickens as well. They would still have been able to keep in urban environments. And as you mentioned, really, that's something that continues through the centuries.
And in regards to preserving and storing food, I imagine this was quite a task, back when you've got no refrigeration. Yeah. Wow. How did they do it?
Yeah. So I think the one we've already mentioned, sugaring. So most commonly, they would have been making quince marmalades. So we don't really have. Do you eat quince over there in Australia?
No. But in Uruguay there is quince paste. My family's from Uruguay and South America.
Okay.
Yeah, so quince paste is quite popular.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of gone out of fashion here, but it's a lovely fruit. But that needs to be cooked to be eaten, and it changes colour when it's cooked, which is very delightful. Anyway, that is where the word marmalade comes from, because it comes from Portugal. The Portuguese word for quince is marmelo. So they would be making marmalades, and they would have cooked them longer than we would, and then it would become a kind of thicker paste. They would even then be able to slice them up and maybe stamp them with elaborate molds and add popular flavours, elite flavours at the time, things like cinnamon, musk or rosewater, things like that. So of course, I'm sure people are aware of kind of the history of sugar, that it's connected, of course, to the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade. Before that, it's largely imported off Canary Islands, places like that, where it had been introduced by Spanish and Portuguese explorers. It's very expensive. It was kept in, under lock and key, so mainly for the wealthy. But as the slavery kind of expands, it becomes cheaper. And that means that people lower down the social scale, yeomen or wealthy farmers, are able to also use sugar sort of in the 17th century. And they would make more like syrups rather than these very sugary jams. Other methods, things like drying, which there were different methods of trying to dry fruit without having much hot sun in England. But a lot of the times the elites would use an oven, which was ordinary people wouldn't have had that. So that's also quite an elite preserve. Salt, on the other hand, it seems to be a common complaint that among kind of the ordinary people that their food is very heavily salted, especially because even into the Protestant era under Elizabeth, the government continues to enforce fish days and fast days of the traditional Catholic Church. So that means Friday, Saturday, even Wednesday at one point they add back in, people are supposed to be eating fish instead of meat or dairy products. And that means that people who don't live by the coast and who aren't wealthy enough to have their own fish ponds, like some of these grand households, would have had very heavily salted fish. And it's this common complaint because it comes and it's just rock hard to keep it quote unquote fresh from its, in its long journey from the coast to the middle of the country. And you have to, of course, try and soak it and get rid of the salt. And then there are some other things like pickling, which I think there's a kind of a revival for now. Using vinegar, or verjuice, basically highly acidic liquids that kill most of the bacteria. So they'd have things like pickled cucumbers, pickled vegetables, that sort of thing. And then the final fun one, I think, is pies, which we now, of course, eat the whole pie. And I think the crust is the best bit. But in the Tudor era, it was almost like Tudor Tupperware. So they would have had a more tasteless crust, and the point was that just protected the contents inside, and then which was normally some kind of meat or like pate, something like that, and then they would have filled it up with a clarified butter, and that way it would have acted like a seal. So pies were really important as a preservation method, and it also meant that pies became quite a fun gift for people to send because they could survive the journey across these sort of old primitive roads to reach your friend who lived on the other side of the country. Yeah, and then over time, in the early modern era, this gets replaced with a technique called potting, which is essentially you just use a pot instead of the pie crust and fill that up with that fat on top to create that seal.
That's amazing. Yeah, I also love the crust on a pie, so I don't think I would have enjoyed that very much. And you talked about the fact that, of course, people are using all the parts of an animal. They're not really wasting anything. So during your research, did you come across any attitudes towards food waste? What did people think about it at the time, and what factors shaped their views?
Yes, so it's definitely a case of food waste being frowned upon. I think in the first instance, just because it was then so precious, in a way, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning there, we've sort of lost touch with how valuable food is because we see it endlessly in supermarkets. But of course, if you're having to kill your own pig or rear that pig, then kill that pig, grow your vegetables and half of them get eaten by pests and then you've got to preserve it, you just wouldn't waste it, And especially in the Elizabethan era, it's a time of repeated famines, years of poor harvests, especially the 1590s. At the same time, there's enclosure, which means that landowners are sort of fencing off common land. And that meant that ordinary people couldn't then use that land to pasture their livestock. There's a sort of economic crisis, really, where the price of flour, for example, nearly tripled between 1593 and 1597, so in a few years. And that led to things like lots of risings. There's the Oxfordshire Rising in 1596, when there's the kind of attempt in Oxfordshire to march on London to try and sort out this crisis in food, basically. And it means that food is seen as such a valuable thing that you wouldn't waste it. And even the middling classes would have had to adapt their diets. It wasn't exclusive to kind of the poor. This has affected everybody. And so there's, recipe books at the time that talk about, how to make your bread with, whatever kind of grain you have lying around, or how to make use of whatever you have, basically. So there's that side of it, the economic side. And the other major factor that's affecting attitudes towards food waste is religion. So at the time of the Reformation, when England is transitioning from Catholic to Protestant, of course, there's a lot of tension, but ultimately no one isn't religious. Everybody's religious. And if anything, that religious fervor is heightened. And that means that food is, in the kind of religious worldview, is seen as this amazing gift from God, which, I mean, actually is the thing that keeps us alive, which allows earthly life to exist. So it's kind of logical that they would therefore see food waste as sinful. And you get all these, priests teaching things like the feeding of the 5,000, which I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with still today, which is when Jesus goes, he's mourning the death of John the Baptist, and he goes and a crowd follow him, but they say they've only got 5 fish and 2 loaves, and he's able to miraculously transform this into a meal that satisfies 5,000. And at the end of the parable, he says something like, gather up the pieces so that nothing be wasted, something like that, to the disciples. So that's used as a teaching point about wasting food. The other one is Dives and Lazarus, so the poor man and the rich man, which is when poor man is begging at the table of the rich man for the scraps from their feast. The rich man refuses, and ultimately the rich man is punished and the poor man is the one who goes to heaven. So that story again is told, and it's even found on plates, on trenchers. So the idea was, in the Tudor era, you're wealthy in this, if you've got money to have nice plates rather than a chunk of bread or the floor or something. But you'd have like a nice, clean plate. And then once you'd had your lovely sweet treats, you'd look on the back and there'd be something like this parable. And then the idea was you were supposed to talk about it with your party guests and sort of remember the importance of not wasting your food and the importance of giving any leftovers to the poor. So those are the kind of attitudes that are kind of universal, I think, in the era. And it means that, it's not just that food itself isn't wasted, but that they would try and make use of even the non-edible parts of an animal. So thinking about hooves and horns that are made into glue, or fat, as I've mentioned, being reused for cooking, but also to make tallow, that was how they would have lit their houses, which was dipping a rush into the fat, basically, and it became a candle. Feathers into pillows, things like that. And perhaps the other thing to mention I think is interesting, is gleaning. So the idea that you can go into the fields at the end of harvest and legitimately take any of the leftovers that are not harvested by the farmer, that is protected kind of in biblical law. There's a story of Ruth who gleans for her mother-in-law who isn't able to kind of feed herself. But interestingly, in this era, there's a conflict between that and an enclosure and the kind of increasingly difficult economic situation, which means that becomes quite a lot of conflict between farmers or landowners and poorer people. So the poorer people are saying, it's my religious right to collect leftovers, and the farmers are saying, get off my land, this is all stuff that could be making me money.
And in terms of the royal court, of course, I'm sure our listeners have heard of those incredible, feasts they held there with 100 different plates and meals. And so what happens there with the leftover food of elite households and the royal court as well? What do they do with all of it?
Yeah. They certainly would have had just far more than they could possibly have eaten. And it was important for them really to kind of show off their prestige through food. But they have, from early on, they have actually quite strict rules and methods of dealing with the leftovers. So we have, for example, an ordinance of 1526 from King Henry VIII's court, which requires scraps, all food scraps and the dregs of ale to be distributed to those in poverty. So you have the almonry who it's their job to collect all of this food. And they also have quite harsh punishments for those in the court. If they didn't send their leftovers to these kind of 2 slop buckets in the kitchens, then they would, on the 3rd offence, have lost their right to lodge in the court. So it was taken pretty seriously, I'd say. The other thing, giving to the poor at the gates would have been common in, of course, the royal households, and it's emulated in elite households. Again, as a kind of aside, in the Elizabethan era, there's this increasing economic tension, which means that it might become less common and people start viewing the poor a little bit more unfavorably, perhaps, into the deserving and undeserving poor. And so that kind of complicates the kind of almsgiving process. But in general, that's one way that they would deal with it. And the other way is to distribute leftovers and scraps to the workers. And actually, they do that in lieu of a form of payment, monetary payment. So another record we have is when King James I comes to the throne in 1603. He's given an account of how the royal household was managed under Elizabeth I. And that shows us how every department, they would have kind of reused their scraps. So things like the kind of manager in the bakehouse was ordered to make sure there was no wastage, and actually took a bit of his fee in the bran from the mill. So everybody would have eaten bread with bran in it, apart from the really wealthy who were making white bread, which is why they would have this leftover bran in the royal court. And so that would be reused to feed to livestock, for example. You got people like who worked in the royal cellars. They were receiving some of the lees, which is like the leftover wine, and also some of the kind of mucky sediment from the winemaking process. And we know that, that could be given to compost heaps to kind of feed a compost heap. It could be reused into vinegar even for pickling. And James Markham and his recipe book of 1615, I think, says that you could use this lees with wheat bran and sheep suet as a kind of a medical cure that you'd put on your arm or your leg when you'd have some swelling. So it had all these different uses. They were very creative. And then meanwhile, people even in the boiling house, which is where they were cooking the meat, would have had the drippings from roast meat, and even the grease coming from the drawers of the beef or the kettles that all this meat was being cooked in, they would have scraped off and kept because it was that valuable.
And you've obviously touched on the fact that food waste is a huge problem. I know I certainly try not to waste food, but it does happen still, and I'm sort of working on that. But why is it, Eleanor, such a big deal? Why should we all be thinking about this?
I would say that the book is in no way preachy about food waste, because I'm the same as everybody else in the modern age, in that it's really difficult not to waste food, I think. And, there are many reasons for that. Bulk buying, overestimating just in fear of disappointing your family, busy schedules. We don't have time in the same way that we would have to kind of think about what everyone's eating every meal and so on. So, that is it's the fact of modern life, and there's only so much we can do. And yeah, that's a big question of how we kind of solve it. But in terms of why we should care about it, the major reason, and I think how food waste is kind of presented and understood today, is that it's an environmental issue. And the book kind of traces how it moves from being something that, as I mentioned, is more of a kind of religious or moral concern into being something that's an environmental concern. But just as one sort of throwaway fact, so in the UK, 4.5 million tons of edible food is wasted every year alone. That's the same CO2 equivalent of 4.6 million return flights from London to Perth. And it's just, when you think about the whole food system, when you waste food, or when we as a society waste food, we're not just wasting that piece of bread. We're wasting energy that's gone into that food from the get-go, from its growing, from fertilizers, pesticides, then transport emissions, people's labor. So many things go into producing one meal. And I think we've kind of lost touch with that, because we're not the people, as I say before, we're not the people picking or cultivating and then preserving and so on our food. So that's a huge part of it is the climate crisis. And as I say, a third of the food we produce globally goes to waste. So it's a huge amount. And the second reason is that it is still, as it was in the Tudor times, a massive economic issue that kind of exposes, I think, the divide between the rich and the poor. So, like the poor who were waiting at the Tudor gates for the scraps of these great feasts, £500 a year wasted needlessly on perfectly edible food, in each of UK households, while at the same time, 14% of UK adults were in food insecurity. I think that's stats from 2022. And of course, on a global scale, food that is wasted could go into the mouths of the 842 million people who are living in food poverty. So it's both incredibly important in terms of the environment and also kind of socially and economically as well.
I don't have a solution either, but I mean, it's certainly important for us to be aware of it, I think, more aware than, because we are a society that just overconsumes, aren't we? Lots of us anyway, not everyone, but lots of us. So certainly something to be aware of. And the last question I have for you, Eleanor, is you've obviously talked about ways that our ancestors dealt with these things, but can you sort of summarize for us, what can we learn from our ancestors about building a more sustainable future?
Well, so there are lots of sort of more specific hints and tips and recipes that I share in the book. So I think one thing is trying to get creative with our leftovers. And some of those recipes are great from the past. So things like a Victorian hash, which is when you reuse cold meat in a kind of stew with tomato sauce or leftover gravy. Things like a hotchpot or a hodgepodge, we might say today, from the Tudor era, which is again, a kind of simple ingredient soup that can be bulked up with stale bread. Or, even from World War II, things like crumb fudge, which is my favorite World War II recipe. It's a kind of chocolate Rice Krispie cake kind of thing, but with stale bread. So there's things like that. There's things like trying to compost. Things like gleaning is another one that I've mentioned, which is actually kind of having some sort of a revival, and you can join gleaning groups and go out and find trees, that apple trees or whatever, that are just otherwise the food is just literally falling to the floor and going to waste. So there's things like those, I suppose, more specific actions that we could take. But I think more generally, we need to kind of reconnect with the value of food, and that means perhaps just trying to grow something in your garden or on your windowsill, like we kind of did in the pandemic, and to kind of feel what it takes to grow, I don't know, one carrot, and how happy you are when that carrot doesn't get eaten, or that it's not 2 inches long, which my carrots were. And especially in terms of meat, I think that's the other thing, is that we've really lost that connection to meat being something that comes from a living animal. So to try and reconnect to thinking about that, and therefore perhaps being more open to eating more of the animal rather than just like the premium cuts. I think that's another good thing. But otherwise, I think for me, just studying the history of food waste, and hopefully for people who read the book and who listen and hear about stories of these ordinary people who did connect to their food in that way, who did spend all this time growing it and cultivating it and preserving it. I think that kind of alone has changed my attitude to food and made me value it better, and kind of to reflect on how lucky and sort of unlucky we are in the sense that we're removed from food production. So that, I think that's the kind of the general thing. But the other thing I would just sort of maybe end on is that although it's a book that praises people in the past and sort of, like I said, there's many tips and fun recipes and things that you can try, it's also a book that says we shouldn't look back on the past completely with rose-tinted glasses, and we don't want to go back to the Tudor era, let's be honest.
No, absolutely.
Especially, and especially in terms of the public health side of it, of food waste. So in those days, there's all these complaints because butchers would just throw animal entrails into the street. Or, in the Victorian era, they've got a very closed kind of food system, in the sense that there's many poor people who collect even the bones off the street to try and get some money to survive, or eat moldy bread or whatever it is. We wouldn't want to emulate that. So I think it's a balance of saying, these are some things that we can take from the past. These are things we want to leave behind. And I sort of end actually on celebrating some of the modern initiatives that are going on, especially outside of governmental initiatives, which are, I think everyone can agree, pretty lackluster. But there's some amazing businesses, technologies that are being developed, and community projects as well that we today are seeing. And I think it's sort of a call to support those more modern initiatives as well.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking about what you said about connection, that connecting with the food. And I think just in general, connecting with nature a bit too is, I know for me, so helpful for your mental health as well, isn't it? I think it's that disconnect that does cause a lot of issues. So it sounds like such a wonderful book and so important. So I recommend everyone runs out and buys it immediately.
Oh,
sounds really good. But the last thing, Ellen, I have one more thing, sorry. And that's the takeaway, the Tudor takeaway. So I ask all my guests for something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. Do you have a takeaway for us?
Yes. So my tip comes from doing my History Eats account on Instagram. I do tend to think through history a lot through images, paintings and objects and things like that. So in general, I'd say go and explore some museum collections, and in particular the Rijksmuseum or the Met Museum are very good. Go and explore their still life collections online. Incredible free resources. Go and look at things like the Dutch still lifes from the Tudor era, because that allows you to really see and almost taste the era, what people were eating, what foods were being traded, what was valuable, what wasn't. And they're beautiful, but they've also got these amazing symbolic qualities as well, like cherries and strawberries were thought to represent the souls of men, or oysters meant lust. So I think it's like a way of getting into their mindset as well. And kind of, you can view these artworks from so many different angles that it's a lot of fun. You can spend a lot of time analysing them and finding new kind of meanings and new little facts about the era in them.
That sounds like a very deep rabbit hole that you could fall in.
Yes,
That's
my life.
And so if people want to find out more about you and your work and follow along, where can they go?
I would say, come over to Instagram at History Eats. I also have a website if you want to learn more about what I'm getting up to in the food history world, which is just eleanorbarnett.com.
Fabulous. And I'll add links to those to our show notes. But thank you so much for taking the time to come back onto the podcast and talk Tudors with us and food with us.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.